Thank you, Rabbi Johnson. Good afternoon. I think some people are really, really disappointed to discover that Chabad is not just about free Shabbos meals, so we apologize in advance. I once received an email from somebody who signed their email address. They signed the email that they sent with a very Jewish-sounding name, and they said that they were a student at UCLA, they were coming to South Africa, they needed a place to stay that would be accommodating of their Jewish needs. So needless to say, I sent a message back, we'd happily have you, you're welcome to come. Somehow got lost in cyberspace until they arrived in South Africa and informed me, don't worry, I found a place to stay, and it was a backpackers hostel in a pretty seedy area. So I was really concerned about this poor student from UCLA, this Jewish girl who was stuck in the middle of who knows where, and I immediately got somebody from our community to rush over there, to rescue her, to bring her to stay with us. And when she arrived, it was pretty clear she was actually a student from Zimbabwe. But she heard her friends had told her, get in touch with Chabad, they'll look after you. Recently we were sitting at the Sheva Brachos for our daughter at our home on Friday evening, and a fellow arrived at the door and he was most upset at the fact that we didn't have place to accommodate him because we were full with all the members of the family who had come for the wedding, and he was most upset, isn't Chabad supposed to be available that when you arrive they have somewhere to put you? So hence it could be a little disappointing when people discover, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that we're not there to assist and to look after people and to care for Jews from one end of the world to the other. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we're not about non-judgmentalism, but I think we have to be really clear about the fact that that's not what Chabad is about. That's part of what Chabad does. And we have to explore what Chabad is about. Because yes, we are Lubavitcher Hasidim. Lubavitch is a city of love, which indicates the unfettered love that we have for every Jewish person. But we have a philosophy called Chabad, Chochma, Bina, Das. That means there's a lot more depth, wealth, and insight than what people think when you come for a Friday night meal. And that's what we're going to explore today. And in order to explore this, let's start just quickly looking at what Chabad isn't, and a little bit at what Chabad might be, and a lot at what the Rebbe says Chabad is. So there are people out there who believe that if you want to summarize Chabad, I actually had a look today, I did a quick Google search, what do people think of Chabad? And a conversation came up on a particular forum where people share questions, insight, answers, and the very first thing that came up was, Chabad is a good place to start if you're looking into Judaism, because, and this is a well-oiled joke which is not so funny, that Chabad is the closest thing to Judaism. So many people believe that what happened was there was a period of history where Jews were in a very difficult space. It was tough to be a Jew. I think that's probably when they coined the Yiddish phrase, es ist schwer zu sein ein Yid. It was difficult. It was difficult financially. Jews couldn't hold down all kinds of jobs. It was difficult from an anti-Semitic position. There were many pogroms, the Chmelnytsky uprising. It was difficult within the Jewish community because there was a chasm in the Jewish community. And thank God, the Baal Shem Tov arrived, and the Baal Shem Tov, and this is, I think, the big misconception, the Baal Shem Tov introduced a kind of Judaism that is quaint and accessible and simplistic so that everybody could participate. And he rescued Judaism at a very critical moment. Some people even go so far as to say, you know what Chabad is? It's Kabbalah light. So if you don't want to go the deep, mystical, learn Chassidus. It's Kabbalah for dummies. It will make the esoteric parts of Judaism accessible. And there's a problem with that, because when you promise people that Kabbalah becomes accessible, they think that they come to the Yarchei Kallah, and at the end they know how to make a golem. And the truth of the matter is, I once spoke to a person who had many, many years as a rabbi in a community, and he said, I don't see what the big deal is of the Maharal of Prague. He only produced one golem, and I've produced hundreds. So Chabad is not just free Shabbos meals. It's not just a person who's not going to judge you no matter which particular philosophy you happen to adhere to. It's not just making Judaism quaint and accessible for people who otherwise feel overwhelmed and intimidated. And it's not Kabbalah light. So what is it? What is this thing called Chabad? And so we're going to discover that Chabad is a state of paradox with the aim of fusion. A state of paradox because when you first encounter Chabad and you first learn about it, you discover that Chabad is predicated on a massive paradox. A massive paradox that is taught as the reason why Hasidus became part of the Jewish experience. On the one hand, we have a very famous mashal, a very famous parable that is used by the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, to illustrate why Hasidus entered the arena in the first place. Everybody knows the mashal, but I'm going to repeat it briefly anyway. It's the mashal of a young man who happens to be a prince who is deathly ill and nobody knows what to do to fix it. They bring in every medical expert, they try every kind of intervention, nothing helps. And now the child is lying comatose. And eventually, one guy raises his hand and he says, I have a radical suggestion. You're the king. In your crown, there's this magnificent jewel. Take the jewel, crush it into a powder, dissolve it in water, pour the solution into the child's mouth. Most of it is going to spill all over the place, but hopefully a few drops go in, and that will be the life-saving elixir, and your son will be cured. And the king obviously says, there's no hesitation, this is what we're going to do. Obviously, we're going to save the child at all costs. Doesn't matter that it's the crown which determines the entire royal presentation of the king. It doesn't matter that it's the most valuable jewel in that crown. We're going to do this. And using that mashal, the concept of Hasidus is the Jewish world was in crisis. We were spiritually comatose. We were at the lowest ebb of the spiritual spectrum. And so we needed an emergency intervention. Hasidus is that emergency protocol. It saved Jewry when we were teetering on the edge. It brought us back then in the Eastern Europe of the Baal Shem Tov, of the Cossacks, of the pogroms, as it brings Jews back today on the edges of all the fringe experiences of society. It's the emergency pack. Give Jews a shot of Hasidus when they are floundering, and they'll find their way back home. Why is that a paradox? Because the other reason we're told that Hasidus entered the Jewish world now is because we're just moments away from the full-blown revelation of divine essence with the coming of Moshiach. We are right now at the pinnacle of the Jewish experience. We have collected all of Jewish cumulative effort across the generations. We have refined and transformed the world. We have elevated ourselves to the point that we are like midgets standing on the shoulders of giants. We are at the threshold of a revolution that's going to reveal God into this world. And so, therefore, we now have access to a taste of that new world, to a taste of that future, to a taste of divine revelation in the most unbridled form. In other words, we're at the pinnacle of all spiritual experience. That's a paradox. Which one is it? Why do we have Hasidus? What is the goal of Hasidus? Specifically, Hasidus Chabad, which took the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and expanded and shared them in such a profound and accessible way. Which one is it? Is it because it's an emergency and the red lights are flashing and we have to do something desperate to save the Jews because one moment more in Galus and who knows what could happen? Or is it because there we are, we're at the finish line. Everything's great. We're at the highest point in the whole of our history and we're about to transition into absolute divine revelation, and Chassidus is therefore already some of that truth peeking through the curtain and illuminating our lives. Are we at the top of the spiritual or the bottom of the spiritual spectrum? Are we a Judaism in collapse or a Judaism in culmination? And both of these are offered as valid explanations of why we have Chassidus now. And not just Chassidus, but Chassidus Chabad. Chassidus you can read and understand and experience and research in the same depth and with the same detail as you would learn a page of Gemara. Is that because it's an emergency? Or is that because things are great? And the answer is, as the answer often is in Judaism, when you ask a question, this or that, the answer is yes. That's why it's a dangerous thing in the Jewish world to offer people, would you like chicken or beef? Because the answer is, thank you, yes. If you give us options, we're going to take both options. So which one is it? Are we at the bottom of the barrel or at the highest level in the whole of history, beyond the prophets, beyond the time of the Talmud, beyond the great Kabbalists like the Arizal? The top or the bottom? Yes. That's the paradox. And you'll see this paradox illustrated in the famous line that is supposed to represent what Chassidus is. And where you're going to find the best definition of what Chassidus is? Well, the Baal Shem Tov went and he had a short interview with Mashiach, an interview that many of us would love to have. Our interview would be pretty short. We'd have a one-word interview with Mashiach. Nu. Baal Shem Tov had exactly that kind of an interview with Mashiach. He was a little bit more respectful, shall we say. Ein osai ka'osi mar. When are you coming? And Moshiach tells him, and that is the slogan of Chabad outreach. When your well springs spread chutza as far and as extremely as possible. And that's a paradoxical statement. That's an absolute paradox right there. You know, in today's world, the best way to market water, because we live in a time where people sell water, which is actually a free commodity we don't produce. The best way to sell water is to put it in a bottle and write on it, bottled at source. Genuine, I saw here, Australian spring water. Which means if it's in the bottle, by definition, it is no longer the spring. It might be from the spring, it might be bottled at the spring, but it certainly is not the spring. You don't open up the bottle and it comes gushing out and then you put your hand as you would at the spring. You don't suddenly have this experience of being out in nature at the top of a mountain. Have you ever had water directly from a spring? It's not like the bottle. By definition, if it's a spring, it's not chutzah. If it's the spring, it cannot be far from the source. By definition. Either you're at the source or you have spread and become a river, and it might be a beautiful river and a gushing river and a river that is a centerpiece of a city, and people sail on the river and they picnic next to the river and they relax at the river, but it's not the spring. How then are we to deal with the paradox of what Mashiach told us? You know when I'll come? I'll come when you get the spring to be as far from the spring as possible. That's a paradox. You can feed from the spring, you can irrigate from the spring, you can channel the spring, you can bottle the spring, but the spring, by definition, is at the spring. And with that, we get this insight into the fact that Hasidus is something unlike whatever else we have experienced in our Judaism prior. And if that's true of Hasidus, generally it's especially true of Chabad Hasidus. Because once you distill information into the kind of well-developed content that Hasidus Chabad teaches, you feel like perhaps this isn't the spring. Perhaps this isn't the source. This is made for consumption. This is presented in such a way that we could relate to it, we could understand it, we could appreciate it. At the spring, you expect to have just the essence, just the kernel, just the core principles, like the Baal Shem Tov's original teachings. They were brief and powerful and inspiring. Not like we learn Hasidus, where it's a mimer and you've got to spend weeks trying to unpack what the mimer is saying and you have to cross-reference and research. That doesn't feel like the spring anymore. That feels like water that's gone through a production process, a refinement process, a purification process. Doesn't feel like the spring any longer. And so the challenge is to unpack that, what appears to be a paradox, but as we shall discover, is actually a fusion of two opposite ends of a spectrum. Because that's what Hasidus is. That's what Chabad is. It's an experience, whether it's when you're learning a mimer, or whether you're interacting with a Jewish person who's completely disengaged from their Judaism, or when you're interacting with the world out there, including the non-Jewish world, including the business dealings that we do. It's when you live in a state of paradox that you recognize it's not paradox. When we have areas of our lives that feel contradictory, it's Hasidus that helps us to appreciate and understand there is no contradiction. It is all harmonious. It is all a matter of fusion. This is the gift of Chabad. So let's try and understand what that means. It sounds like a wonderful idea. I'm sure if we marketed it and sold it, we'd actually do it as a fundraiser for the Kollel. We could do a great job. People would be lining up. The world of fusion. But what do we actually mean with this? And what's interesting about it is the founder of Hasidus Chabad, the Alter Rebbe himself, is the embodiment of fusion of two completely different worlds. That's why the Baal Shem Tov identified that his name would be Shnei Or. Shnei Or, two lights, two completely different channels, two completely different manifestations of godliness in this world that normally don't work in tandem, that normally don't accommodate each other, and here they're presented in a single name, Shnei Or. So if we learn a little bit about the Alter Rebbe as a start, and then we learn a little bit about the Hasidus that he taught, we'll get this incredible revolutionary perspective on something we all take for granted because we're blessed to be part of this community. Something we take for granted because obviously we are Chabad, obviously we learn Hasidus, but we don't necessarily pause to reflect on what the gift of that access is. So why is the Alter Rebbe called Shnei Or? Because the Alter Rebbe was an outstanding scholar in the classical sense. When the Maggid of Mezrich had to choose from all of his students, all of whom were tremendous scholars in their own right, when he had to choose one of them to rework the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, so it should be accessible and should have the resources you need to fully understand the halacha, he chose the Alter Rebbe. Because the Alter Rebbe was in a group of outstanding scholars, the outstanding classical scholar. He had that ori, he had that light of what we call Nigle de Torah, the revealed part of the Torah. The part of the Torah that's classic Jewish learning, that everybody does. Halacha distills the practical, revealed, accessible part of Judaism. Anybody can relate to halacha. Everybody appreciates the need for halacha. You have to have rules, otherwise how does this religion operate? So on the one hand, he has the Or, he has this incredible light and contribution in the terms of classical Judaism, what we call the revealed or exoteric part of Judaism. And at the same time, the Alter Rebbe is this revolutionary in the other light of Torah, the mystical part of Torah, the esoteric, the hidden, the concealed, the part of the Torah that we don't naturally have access to. And we need somebody to guide us through, as the Alter Rebbe did by producing the book of Tanya, which of course is the foundation of the whole of Chabad Hasidus. Shnei Or, two distinct areas of scholastics, two distinct areas of contribution to Judaism. Now, if you are familiar with Jewish history, as I'm sure everybody is, you'd say, but he wasn't the first. The Alter Rebbe wasn't the first person to contribute in different areas of Torah. We have a number of scholars who were outstanding both in the legal or the Talmudic and in the mystical. And perhaps the best example of that would be Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who is the icon of Kabbalah, the producer of the Zohar, on which all Kabbalistic tradition essentially is founded, is the same Rabbi Shimon who is one of the most prolific names in the Talmud, one of the greatest contributors to legal Judaism. So there you have it. What's so surprising about the Alter Rebbe? That he excelled in two areas when there are other sages who did pretty much the same. And this is where things get really interesting. Because typically in our history, we've always been able to identify that people can be masterful in different areas of life. It's not unique only to the Jewish experience. There's a guy in our community who is one of the most popular videographers at weddings. He didn't used to belong to our community. He belonged to a different community. And so I grew up my whole life seeing him at weddings taking videos. And I was absolutely sure that his particular area of expertise was video production. And then a few years ago he moved suburbs and he joined our community, and I suddenly discovered that the guy has a medical practice. It's possible to be proficient in different areas of life. Many of us do it. That's not the chap of the Alter Rebbe. And that's not the chap of Chassidus. It's not about having two channels, Shnei Or, two different things that you share with the world, two different areas of expertise. That's not the chap. The chap is the fusion of the two. What the Alter Rebbe successfully does, and hadn't been done before, is the translation of mystical ideas within the areas of revealed parts of the Torah. And even beyond that, the translation of mystical ideas into language that is even not technically Torah language, into using examples of things that are part and parcel of our world, the translation of concept into practice, the marriage of neshama and body. Let's look at it from that perspective, because we're told often that the esoteric part of Judaism is the nishmasa de'oraisa, it's the soul of Torah, and the exoteric part of Judaism is gufa de'oraisa, the body of Torah. So let's just think for a second. When you meet another person, when you meet for the first time, let's say you've never met this person before, you meet the person for the first time, you go back and somebody says, "Nu, you met so-and-so, what did you think of them?" How often do we go home and say, "They have this incredible neshama"? I'm not saying it never happens, but how often does it happen? Walk back and say, "That person, I just felt their neshama shining right through them." It's not typically what happens. Usually what happens is we walk out and we say, "I think they're a decent person. They seem interesting. They have a particular area of expertise. They ask questions in a particular way. They think in a particular way." That's how we identify people, based on their bodies. In other words, when you look at a person, no matter who they are, no matter what relationship you have with them, do you see their neshama? When last did you see a neshama? Be careful answering that question, because if you say you have been seeing neshamas, we may escort you and put you in a white padded cell. Because we're not designed to see neshamas, we're designed to see bodies. And if the body is alive, that is evidence to the fact that it contains a neshama. But the body is a body, and the neshama is a neshama. And seeing as I'm using a body to look at the next person, I'm only able to identify their body. And even if I try really, really hard to look at a person through the lens of my neshama, assuming that I know how to get there, I'm still not going to see their neshama. There are two channels. We live on two channels, the body channel and the soul channel. And most of the time we're engaging with each other on the body channel, which includes the mind and emotions, because those are all physical, human experiences. And we're not engaging with each other on the neshama level. So we're able to identify two different channels and say the one indicates the presence of the other, but when I look at the one, I don't see the other. And if I'm gifted to see the person's neshama, at that moment I'll be blinded to their body. And it's exactly the same in Torah. There's nishmasa d'oraisa, the esoteric parts of Torah, and there's gufa d'oraisa, the tangible parts of Torah. So typically, if you're learning halacha, I don't know, you're learning about what happens in your kitchen when there's a kitchen disaster. Shouldn't talk about such things, right? Some people are becoming anxious. When you're learning the halacha about what happens when your beloved family member stirs the cholent pot with the milk spoon. At that point that you're learning that halacha, whatever the halacha is, I'll leave it to the rabbis to tell you what the halacha is. But whatever, while you're learning the details of, was it 60 times, was it hot, when last was the spoon used, was there anything that could have made it taste bad, when you're doing all of that, how many of us at that moment are just feeling, oh, I'm feeling the godliness, I'm feeling the holiness. We're channeling gufa d'oraisa. We're channeling the body aspect of Judaism, the tangible, the practical, the exoteric experience of Judaism. That's what we're dealing with. You want to be inspired. I don't know, maybe you're different. I haven't had anybody ever come to me, Rabbi, I want to be inspired. Can we learn the laws of fill in the gap? No. People are, Rabbi, I want to be inspired. Tell me something mystical. Again, I don't know how it is over here, but generally speaking, if you put up a topic for a shiur and it has the word Kabbalah in it, you're going to get a crowd. If you're going to put up a sign on the shiur and say, come join us for a shiur about the laws of Shemitah, most people say, I'll see you in 7 years. The only chance we have is if we say, come learn the Kabbalah of Shemitah. Maybe somebody will come. Because we all want the soul. We want the inspiration. Give me something intangible that's not going to force me to change my life, but it's going to give me a warm fuzzy inside. I'm there. And it's a crime, I think, that people believe that's Chabad. The warm fuzzy. The stuff that's going to make you feel good. And then you can go home and remain the same. And that's not Hasidus Chabad. It's a marriage. It's a fusion between a world of esoteric Judaism and its practical realization. So that when you do learn the laws about what to do with that spoon that got mixed into the cholent, we won't discuss the laws of what to do with the person who used the spoon. But when you deal with the laws of the spoon that got into the cholent, you won't see that as some sterile part of ritualistic religion, but you'll see it as a channeling of divinity in your home. You'll see it as an expression of God in the kitchen. Now we take this for granted because it's become so much part of the Jewish experience thanks to Hasidus Chabad. But that's what Chabad does in the world of Torah. It illustrates to us that the different aspects of Torah all run with one truth that unites them all. There's a fusion between the practice and the inspiration, between the faith and the understanding. And that's why it's Hasidus Chabad, because it's taking the giant neshama connection that we have to God through Torah and bringing it into things we can learn in language we could use with examples that everybody can relate to. A couple of weeks ago, somebody called me up. I really, don't let us get out of this room other than the fact that it's recorded, but he created a real dilemma for me, this individual, because he said, you know, I really think you're not doing yourself a service as a rabbi. I'm like, what do you mean? I love my job. What's the issue? He says, you should really be coaching business people. He says, I'm a business coach. I make good money. And you teach better stuff, and everybody takes it for free because you're a rabbi. He says, let's redo your whole persona. We're going to call you a coach, and you're going to take the things that you teach me in Tanya for free, and you're going to charge the top corporates top dollar to do this. And I'm thinking, hang on a second, isn't this whole thing about chutzah? Like getting as far, maybe he's onto something. You know, we've got to get as far as we possibly can. But really what he was saying is, you teach through Tanya or through the Rebbe Sichos or through other parts of Hasidus, you teach these amazing spiritual principles that are so relatable. Tanya talks about how we deal with disappointment, how we self-motivate, how we create structures within teams that work based on the 10 Sephiros. You can see this is a whole coaching thing, right? And I'm not debating here whether he's right or wrong, but what's beautiful about his insight is that he's identifying this fusion. He's identifying the fact that we are no longer flying at some altitude because we're learning esoteric Judaism. Hasidus brings esoteric Judaism into the fabric of life, into the fabric of the Torah as we learn it in other aspects, and then beyond the Torah. How we come to recognize that Judaism is not a book for life, or worse, a book for religion. Torah is wisdom of life. It is the ultimate perspective of how we're supposed to read everything. That's quite a shift. Some years ago, there was you've got to be careful now because South Africa's government is not a big friend of Israel, you may have noticed. So some years ago, when there was a different government in Israel, different government in South Africa, they actually sent one of the prime ministers of South Africa to Israel. And we have a word in South Africa called verkrampt. You understand what it means, right? So he was considered a verkrampte prime minister, meaning to say he was from the old school. And he arrives on this tour in Israel, and everybody's falling over their feet because it was one of the most prominent visitors Israel had at the time, in the 1970s. And they were trying to make various partnerships on development of military material. So they took him to see one of the most elite army bases in Israel, in the north of Israel. In those days, there were elite groups in Israel, not like now in the Israeli army where every group is an elite group. You know what they say? Everybody tells you for who knows how long, I belonged to an elite group in Israel, and then when they call in all the reservists, that guy's still in shul. So at that time, like when they said elite, it was actually unique. And this prime minister arrives on this elite base, which most people are not even supposed to know exists. And he's getting a tour of the base. And they're trying to tell him how the Israeli army is so amazing and brilliant and whatever. And the next thing, in drives a mitzvah tank. And out of the mitzvah tank come bounding a whole bunch of unruly, disheveled, shirt untucked, flowing beard, Chabadniks with menorahs, which is one thing, and donuts. This is this crack unit of the IDF, and they're handing out donuts. And then they're playing music, and they start dancing, and the Israeli delegation is turning colors, and they don't know where to put themselves. They are so embarrassed, and what are they going to do? And so, as it happens, Yitzhak Rabin was the head of the delegation, and he turns to the Prime Minister from South Africa, and he says to him, trying to salvage the situation, he says, Your Excellency, you have to understand, this is Chabad. And his intention was to go on and say, fringe group, we don't approve, we don't even know how they got here. Like, that's where he's going with this. He says, this group is Chabad. At that point, the South African Prime Minister interrupted him and said, I know what Chabad is. Chabad is an organization who is dedicated to bringing light to even those places where people are in the worst type of darkness. And he was almost right, except it's not about bringing light to the darkness. which would be the same as bringing the spring to the place that is far from the spring, in which case it's no longer a spring. It's about revealing the fusion that exists potentially between what is currently dark and what is already light. So in exactly the same way as within the Torah itself, the Alter Rebbe revolutionized that we don't have two areas of expertise, the esoteric and you can be a Kabbalist, and the legal and you can be an halachist, but rather seeing in halacha the spirituality, and in the spirituality the practical, that there are two fused realities. As the Rebbe says countless times, whatever we read in Nigla the Torah, the revealed parts of the Torah, must be a reflection of Nistar, the hidden parts of the Torah. And equally, he'll always say, and what we learn in Kabbalistic terms must have an anchor in Nigla. It has to track back to something that is applicable in the revealed part of the Torah, because they are fused. They're not paradoxical, they are one. It's not a conflict, it's a harmony. That's in Torah. But the reason we have Torah is because they are Jews. It's a very famous midrash, right? Be'reishis, that the world was created, Be'reishis, the base is large to represent the number 2, and Reishis represents two things which the Torah identifies as the first, the primary, the Jewish people and the Torah. Be'reishis, the world was created, the universe was created, the spiritual multiverse was all created for two things that are called Reishis, the Jewish people and the Torah. And then I'll ask, and of the two, which is primary? There are two primary forces behind creation. And of the two, which is primary, says the Midrash, simple. Look in the Torah and it says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael. Address the Jews. The Torah is here to address the Jews. The Torah is here because of the Jews. The Jews are the core, the epicenter, the reason why everything exists. So if we're going to identify fusion, that Chabad is the fusion of areas of Torah, it only really manifests properly when it turns into the fusion of ourselves. Because we're also living this dichotomy of body and soul, and the conflict of body and soul. And the neshama wants to go this way, and the body wants to go that way, and we have conflict, and we have dilemma, and we're not sure, and how do we prioritize, and how do we create balance in our lives, because that's a big thing in today's world. Everybody has to have balance. And Hasidus Chabad illustrates that it's actually not about finding balance, it's about finding harmony. It's not about trying to put two parts of our world together and in sync. It's about discovering that the two parts of our world are actually one. There were a group of shluchim years ago, young bochrim, who went on Merkaz Shlichus, which is when you get sent by Central Chabad to rural or remote areas to find Jewish people and engage them in a Jewish way during the summer months. So these bochrim landed up in Japan. Again, we're talking probably in the 1970s, when Japan was further than it is now. And there they are, and they identify two Jewish-looking people. The Chabadniks are trained to do this. Racial profiling, religious profiling, whatever you want to call it. We know how to tell who the Jewish people are. I very often had people say, "How did you know I was Jewish?" Well, you just, answered a question with a question. I said, do you want to put on tefillin? How do you know? So they find these two guys, and they're clearly Jewish. Would you like to put on tefillin? Turns out they're Israeli. The one guy says, of course, b'chavod, no problem. The second guy says, I have to tell you, I was at the Kollel in Jerusalem, and the Chabadniks there tried to get me to put on tefillin at the Kollel in Yerushalayim, and I said no. Shortly after that, I was in New York on 5th Avenue, and the Chabadniks there tried to get me to put on tefillin, and I said no. He says, would you believe it? Just a few days later, I'm in Philadelphia at the Liberty Bell, and Chabadniks come over to me and they say, would you like to put on tefillin? And I said no! But if your Rebbe sent people all the way to Japan to find me, how can I say no? It's a whole different level of stalking. So what is it? Is it because we've been trained that every Jew has potential? Wonder, you don't know. You might meet that Jew in Japan, and you might put on tefillin with them, and you don't know. In 20 years' time, you might walk into a yeshiva in Jerusalem, and this person's going to come over and say, "Do you remember me?" And you're going to say no, and as they'll say, "I'm the guy from Japan," and you'll write a book and you'll tell the story and you'll do a speaking tour because look at that, you met a guy in Japan and now he became from. Is that why we do it? We track down Jews because they have potential. They're living in a fractured reality where actually their neshama is alive, but currently their conscious self is completely detached. So hopefully we can override the current self with the inner self, and then they'll come around. Is that what we do? You know what they call that? It's got a name. That process of finding people and discovering and revealing their potential. It's called kiruv. That's a name that says they're far away, but don't worry, we're the experts, we'll reel them in. That's not Hasidus Chabad. Hasidus Chabad is to understand that there is a harmony between neshama and conscious self. And our objective is to activate that harmony, not to make people religious or observant, not to help them balance their job and their commitment to Judaism. Hasidus Chabad is to help people realize there's a well in me, there's a spring in me. No matter how chutzah, how distant the person might appear, they never left the source. You cannot leave the source. You are the source. And that's not only for other people, incidentally, it's for us too. It's for us when we deal with and grapple with whichever particular issues we have in our own Judaism, where very often we feel, I don't know if I have the resilience, I don't know if I have the wherewithal, I don't know if I have the discipline, I don't know if I have the focus, I don't know if I have the enthusiasm, I don't know if I have the knowledge, and a dozen other reasons that we come up with to say that we are actually in a fractured state. Hasidus Chabad says we have to look in the mirror and see in ourselves, we are the source. It's a fusion of our deeper self with our conscious self that each of us is absolutely capable of. That each of us is definitely empowered to live as not just religious Jews, but as Jews who are one with our core. Or let's put it this way. A healthy person is a person who lives more guided by the neshama than by the base self, what we call in the language of Hasidus, the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, right? A healthy person is somebody who's guided by the godly soul, the nefesh rakis, rather than the animal soul. So they're not wild, they're not all over the place, they're not undisciplined, they're not base, they're not hedonistic. They have altruism, they have a connection to God, they have wisdom, they have insight. That's the goal, right? So how does this look? What's actually supposed to happen? There are two possibilities. The one possibility is that we ramp up our neshama, we feed our neshama, we excite our neshama to such an extent that the neshama overwhelms the drag in the other direction. So I do have a part of me that would like to misbehave, but I'm just so enthused by my neshama that part of me doesn't get to have a voice. And in the language of Torah, we call that a person who conducts their life Kol ma'asecha le-shem shamayim. Everything that we do is directed to higher purpose, is directed to connection to God. It's a great way to live. It's fantastic. We'll be so aligned with what Hashem wants. But we won't be in a state of fusion yet. We'll be in a state of, I do things for a goal. There is me and the goal. There's a mayon, there's a spring, and I'm chutzah away from the spring, finding my way back with every action that I take directed towards higher purpose, directed towards what Hashem wants. It's an amazing place to be. It's a very advanced way to live. It's not the objective of Chabad Hasidus. Because there's always a sense of tension between soul and consciousness. So what's the ultimate? Well, here's the ultimate. The ultimate is right now, until I mention this, Right now, how many people in this room have been feeling their wrist? Now suddenly you start to think, oh, I have a wrist? The only people who've been feeling the wrist are the people who are getting edgy about the time. Because if there's a part of our body that is healthy, we don't know it's there. We don't feel it. We only start to feel parts of the body when they're not healthy. That's like the old joke that they say. The Gemara tells us that if a person has a headache, chosh beroishoi, yasek b'torah. If a person has a headache, they should learn Torah. Torah will get rid of the headache. I don't know, most people get a headache from learning Torah. So how does this work? So the old joke is they say, learn Torah, you'll realize you don't have a head. How could you have a headache? So when is it that a person feels uncomfortable? When do you feel a part of the body? When it's not behaving right, when it's misaligned, where there's dissonance. That's when we feel a part of our bodies. When everything is healthy, we don't feel it. It's seamless. It just works. When is a person in a healthy relationship? When they don't have to say every 5 minutes, I love you, darling, all these things. I don't have to say it because we're in a healthy relationship. It's seamless. We don't need some kind of tabs or some kind of add-ons to be able to remind us that there's a relationship. The relationship between neshama and body is healthiest when I don't have to have an agenda for my neshama. I don't have to remind myself of the things neshamas are supposed to do every day. Kol ma'asecha le shem shamayim. Everything I'm going to do will be directed towards heaven. And so the more advanced state is what we call bechol drachecha da'ehu. Whatever I'm doing is an expression of connection to Hashem. I'm in a state of fusion. This is me. My ideals and my reality are one. My esoteric self and my revealed self are one and the same. I don't have two separate channels. And that's why it's interesting that the Alter Rebbe's name is not just Shnei Or, but it's Shnei Or Zalman. And the Rebbe points out that the word Zalman is the same letters as the word Lizman. Zman is time, the most finite constraint on our lives. Time. The greatest reminder that we're finite, the greatest reminder that we're stuck in this world. Shnei Or Zalman is the fusion of the greatest light, insight, spirituality, soul that we could hold within ourselves. Lizman, in the here and now. That's Chassidus Chabad. Chassidus Chabad is, it doesn't matter where we are, it doesn't matter what our challenges are, it doesn't matter what we've done in our past, it doesn't matter who we're connected with, it doesn't matter how much we do or don't understand, how much we're lizman, stuck in the mire of this world, doesn't matter. Shnei Or, the neshama shines right through, the Torah shines right through, it becomes and should be us. We don't bottle the water at source, we are the source. We uncover the spring that's in us. So we don't go out non-judgmentally because we love all Jews, so we'll overlook their shortcomings. We don't offer free meals because it's great and important for people to have an address wherever they are in the world, especially if there's no representation of other Judaism. They need a place to go. We're not out sharing bottled water to people who are thirsty. We're aligned with the essence of Torah, which is what Hasidus teaches, that exposes the essence of the Jew. So we realize how much power we have and how much value every other Jew has, and the essence of what the world is about. So no matter where we are, and what we're dealing with, it doesn't obstruct our connection to Hashem. To the contrary, we fuse it into our service of Hashem. The Mayon Chutza. We take the essence of the spring and illustrate that it's actually in the place we previously identified as distant and disconnected. And that's why there's that paradox of the reasoning why we have Hasidus in today's world. On the one hand, because things are so shocking, because people are so desperate, because they really, really need something that's going to shock them back into spiritual awakening, on the one hand. And simultaneously, because we're at the pinnacle of history, because we're so close to Mashiach, because we're at the time of the eve of absolute revelation, those are not contradictory or paradoxical terms. It's because Hasidus is the fusion of those two realities. Every other modality of Judaism believes that you have to be in a healthy place spiritually to be able to access deep connection. And if, God forbid, things are not healthy, there's a long journey before you can get to deep connection. But once Hasidus shares with us the essence of what Judaism is about, the essence is no matter what chutzah, no matter how far we are, the mayon is there, the spring, the source is accessible. So then dafka, when we are at the pinnacle of history, ready to invite Mashiach into our homes, into our lives, ready to expose godliness to the entire world, that's when we have the power to touch the people who need emergency intervention. Because the principle of Hasidus is simple. As long as we're dealing with anything that is finite and defined, it can only work within a finite or defined arena. So if I'm dealing with intellectual Judaism, then I can only use it as a means to connect with people who are academic and appreciate intellectual things. If I'm dealing with emotional Judaism, then it's only going to be viable for people who are emotional people. And if they're cerebral people, the emotional Judaism to them is going to look like happy clappy, and I don't want any of it. And if we're just going to deal with practical Judaism, that's going to appeal to highly practical people who don't need all the fluff and excitement. Just tell me what to do. And then we're going to have a whole lot of different streams of Judaism. But when you touch the essence of something, it's the essence of every part of it. Our DNA is not only the DNA of our brain and heart, it's the DNA of our heel and nails. Because the essence is the essence of everything. And therefore the essence can touch, illuminate, and transform everything. And as we're so close to Mashiach, the time of the revelation of the essence of everything, the revelation of what Hashem intended and what Hashem is, we now have access to this modality called Hasidus Chabad that can touch everyone within the Jewish world, every part of the Torah, and even every facet of the world that is outside of the pale of holiness, and can illustrate the essence of everything and bring it all into one fused reality. It doesn't matter who, where, or what. It's all connected to Hashem. And when we succeed in discovering that in our own perspective, in our own outlook, in our own lives, Asi Mar, that's when Mashiach comes. Because Mashiach is all about that reality becoming the reality. And we are the privileged individuals who've been given access to Hasidus Chabad, who have the capacity to unlock that next dimension, that ultimate dimension of reality for the entire world. And all we need to do in order to unlock it is pick up a book of Hasidus and start learning more. And with Hashem, we should see the revelation of the essence of everything with the coming of Mashiach immediately.